Hello, I'm John Morrow, and I'm here today on behalf of the Nebraska Leadership Conference. With me today is my guest, John Decamp. John is an attorney here in Lincoln. He is also a lobbyist. He's a former state legislator. He's a Vietnam veteran. I understand he's also a big pig farmer.
Right.
And now he's an author. And we're here to interview John about his new book entitled The Franklin Cover-Up, subtitled Child Abuse, Satanism, and Murder in Nebraska. Wow. John, how did you get involved in this mess?
Quite accidentally. I had been a senator for about 16 years and had been at the two Republican National Conventions, 1984 and 1988, as a delegate pledged to Reagan in the first instance and Bush in the second, and come across a man named Larry King, who was the individual who opened those two national conventions, sang the national anthem, was told he was the fastest rising star, particularly fastest rising black star in the Republican Party, and attended some of his largest parties ever put on by him, and from my recollection, probably two of the largest, most expensive parties ever put on by anybody in this country. And so when the Franklin Credit Union failed, I had more than a passing interest in observing and following up and seeing what it was all about.
The credit union was closed, for the information of our viewers, on November 4th of 1988. The FBI and IRS came in and closed it down.
Right. And this was supposed to be a $2 million credit union that was just a minority credit union designed to help the black people in the Omaha area. In fact, as they quickly discovered, and we don't even know this is the truth or not the truth at this point, it could be far, far more, but they discovered 40 million missing. Well, when you only have 2 to start and you have records that show you stole 40, creates some baffling questions. And
yeah.
Of course,
who's keeping the books?
and that opened up the whole thing, and I was attorney for one of the senators who was, personal attorney for one of the senators who was chairman of the committee looking into that, Senator Lawrence Schmidt, and one thing led to another, and I became attorney for a number of other people involved in the matter. And
now, in January of 1990, there was published what has now become known as the famous or the infamous, depending on your viewpoint, Decamp memo. And in that memo, there were certain prominent people in the Omaha community who were named as being very much involved not only in the Franklin failure, but involved in the allegations that arose out of that failure, specifically with respect to ritual and sexual child abuse. And there were some mighty, mighty repercussions that really set off some big tremors in the Omaha community. Can you give us some background information on that memo and the way it came about and how?
Well, believe it or not, the real cause of the memo were articles in the Lincoln Journal and Star that were not accurate about an incident, number one, and then number two, pressure from the World Herald reporter to me to say, hey, how do you know information? Where do you get information? What do you know about Franklin? How come you won't tell these things? And I said, hey, wait a minute, fellas. You're the investigative reporters. You're the ones that have the information. You're the ones that are covering up, and here are the reasons you're doing it. And here's what the public knows. And I just laid it out. And people said, well, gosh, aren't you afraid of being sued? You're naming some of the most potent and powerful folk in this entire state, the people that pull the chains and call the shots. And I said, yeah, I know they do. And that's why it's so serious. That's why it's so terrible. And I said, am I afraid of being sued? No, heck, I think it'd be good for them to sue me. Let's find out the truth.
Right.
And I said, point number one, truth is a defense. And anything I wrote in that memo, and we're talking about the memo right now specifically, anything I wrote in that memo, I guarantee you, is the truth. At least the truth as I see it.
Right, there was no malicious intent in it.
Well, there certainly wasn't, but it's the truth. What more can I say? And I guess there was a backlash. And as a result of that memo, primarily, as I recall, they quickly created a grand jury. And again, it's my opinion, because that pretty much is where this book starts. If anything, that created the real organized effort for a true cover-up, which is the essence,
Now,
the story
actually,
of the
your
book.
memo was directed initially to the newspaper, to the media, and not to the public, but it got circulated to the public through a man in Omaha who was running for political office, and he got a hold of the memo some way.
Oh, well,
And
understand something. I have a pretty standard rule I follow right now today, and always have, and that is, if I talk to you functioning as a member of the press, and that's how you're functioning here today. You're functioning as a member of the press. I figure if I say it to you, it's public. I shouldn't be able to say, well, I didn't want you to tell anybody that. If I'm telling you it, it's on the record, or I shouldn't be talking about it. Unless I specifically say, okay, Reverend, we are agreed that we're going to talk about one specific thing right here. It's off the record. I'm providing you information. But that may be the exception, but I made it clear. When I send a memo to the press to answer the press questions to me, then it's in the hands of the public. They can do what they want with it. So whether this young man or whoever he was that distributed the memo because he got a copy of it from this or that, I don't know where he got a copy. I understand today, I've learned this just in the last week, he got it from some member of the press in Omaha.
That was my understanding, that it was the
Big deal.
The press itself.
What I said should have been said and should have been made public. I hoped the World Herald would print it. They never did, of course, because as I try to document in the book, I believe the World Herald, if you were going to pick an institution of government, and that's what our major press is, they're institutions of government. They are, if anything, the centerpiece, the heart of the cover-up, and of course they have a very vested interest in doing that.
And for the benefit of our viewers, again, why do they have a vested interest?
I think you and I will never know all the reasons, but for sure because of some of their personalities involved. Harold Anderson was the publisher and probably the major stockholder in the World Herald, and Harold Anderson was, if anything, the protege, the godfather, if you want to use a word, of Larry King.
In the promotion of the credit union.
Well, certainly in that, and I'm sure in a lot of other ways.
He did promote a lot in the way of fundraising for the credit union.
Yeah,
and
more than that.
Went out and got depositors and generated funds and helped with...
Well, he was the chairman of the committee that told Larry King, the advisory committee, that theoretically told him what to do, or how to do it, or why to do it, or whatever.
But then, of course, the advisory committee, after this broke, they all maintained that not any of them ever knew what was going on, and so apparently no one was advising the advisory committee.
Well, I rather suspect that maybe I'll use the words of former Governor Bob Crosby when he was describing Harold Anderson. He said, you know, this man is probably, I think he said, the best investigative reporter in the history of the state. He rose to the pinnacle of power, ownership of the World Herald, publisher. Here he is, the chairman of the advisory committee. Here he is in probably the closest contact of anybody with Larry King. One has to believe that somebody of his talent in that position, raising the money for building the credit union and everything else, that he had more than a passing knowledge
My understanding,
of Larry King and his activities.
My understanding was that Larry King's salary from the credit union was never really much more than about $16,000 a year.
I believe that's correct, yes.
And he did have several catering businesses and had interests in a couple of restaurants.
I believe that's correct
But
also.
none of them were really very great income producers, and yet he lived an extremely flamboyant lifestyle with extravagant gifts to his many male friends and proteges. And you mentioned, of course, the two very, very expensive parties.
Reverend, you're much more polite in beating around the bush. Let me put it the way it is. Larry King was a very evil person who stole money, was involved in child abuse, Satanism, and all these other things. That's what this book documents. He was an evil person. He had a lot of other people connected with him. He did not act alone. He was protected, and his little time he's going to spend in prison is probably nothing more than a respite, and I'm sure he's going to be well taken care of when he comes out. Larry King was merely a functionary of a lot of other people doing a lot of bad things.
So this whole business of the Franklin cover-up then has been operating virtually from the beginning, although in the initial stages the World Herald was making some noises like being investigative in their
reporting. The World Herald wrote more on, supposedly, according to them, and I'm repeating them, they wrote more on Franklin than they have on any other subject in the history of the World Herald. That's their statements, as I recall. So yes, but as I try to document, they were half-truths. They were designed for a purpose. They were designed to complete the cover-up. Remember, they had a big interest. Not only was Harold Anderson a centerpiece of this activity of Franklin and the Preful things and the allegations and accusations, but another key individual there, among others, and I'm sure there's more than just another key individual, Peter Citron.
Right.
Remember when I named him in the memo? I named Peter Citron,
right.
and the word was out. Well, they were going to use Peter Citron was going to be the one that comes out and sues John Decamp for saying these horrible things about him. I don't know if you remember at the time, but that was the message that was delivered to me. Well, unfortunately, Peter ran into some problems himself, because when families in the Omaha area whose children associated with Peter Citron regularly, when their mothers would confront these little boys, and I'm talking about little boys, you know, anywhere from 9 to 10, 15 11, 12, or whatever, he'd say, these terrible things they're saying about Peter Citron, is any of this true? And then, you know, a mother can be a pretty strong force when she gets concerned about something and starts confronting her young boy, and one after another, the little boys started pouring out the tales of what was going on. And so the police and the people who would have who were claiming Peter was as innocent as the driven snow, and they were, they had no choice. They had to deal with the fact. And so they seized, I guess, thousands of documents of
upwards
pornographic.
Of 10, probably over 10,000 different ones.
I don't know. And I talked to the judge, you know, after the whole trial was over and Peter was sentenced. And it was a very quick deal where he quickly pleaded guilty and then was put in the mental health place.
He's out.
The judge said it was the most frightening, shocking child abuse things he'd ever seen in his entire life, or even heard, or even couldn't even believe it existed. So, of course, under those conditions, Peter was not in a very good position to claim he was as pure as the driven snow and sue me. And the next thing that happened, of course, was, as I recall, the grand jury pretty well quickly formed. Unfortunately, the grand jury, in my opinion, and I'm giving my opinion, right? In my opinion, and I think I've offered the documentation to support it if anybody wants to read it. The documentation the World Herald, of course, didn't. They give the other side, which is, I guess, their right as a newspaper. The documentation to support the grand jury was merely a very, very carefully crafted piece of the cover-up, an essential piece. And from there on, it just continued.
Yeah, speaking of the...
But anyway, to answer your question, that we started this whole conversation, you said, well, why'd you write the book, or something like that, as I recall. I'm going to read you 3 of the opening paragraphs of the book, and then tell you a quick story, because they pretty well tell you why I wrote the book. Because I'm the last person on this planet who I ever thought would be writing a book. When you opened, you said, the latest book. Rest assured, it's my only book, at least at this point. And who knows, I may write another one someday, but here's how it opens. As I say, I'm just going to take a couple minutes and read this because I think it'll tell you why I, who wish I'd never heard of Franklin, am sitting here writing a book trying to document that some of my closest friends over the years are part of a massive cover-up. And that's what I'm doing. I'm destroying friendships one on another. I'm destroying myself in a very real sense. You know it and I know it.
Certainly financially.
But I just had no choice at some point. Okay, so here's how it starts. What do Ronald Reagan, President George Bush, former CIA Director William E. Colby, Democratic presidential candidate Bob Kerrey, billionaire and second richest man in America, and now head of Salomon Brothers Warren Buffett, and Ronald Roskins, the current administrator of the Agency for International Development, all have in common? I asked my close friend and advisor William Colby one day in 1991. I give up, former head of the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, Colby said. What could that group have in common? 3 things, I replied, all of them a burden at times for those who have to carry them. The 3 things are me, John Decamp, a case called Franklin, and a man named Larry King. And then I go on in this very brief opening forward to explain why I was with Colby. He's friend, advisor, going back to Vietnam days. I was in Washington, staying at his place, and I was telling him, you know, I'd received these threats, and he was somewhat familiar with Franklin. It had received national press, and I think he had a lot more knowledge than I'll ever know he had. But anyway, he was warning me to get away from it, to stay away, to leave it alone, to not touch it anymore. And I said, wait a minute, Bill, you know, how can you walk away from something when you know terrible things are happening, when you know institutions of government that we all rely on, that they're being corrupted?
Yeah, that's the real tragedy of the thing.
That's a real tragedy. And then he said to me, he said, John, sit down, just cool off and relax. And Sally, his wife, was there. Sally, by the way, was, I think, ambassador to more countries than any other person has ever been in the history of the United States, appointed by Carter. So Sally's got a little heavy-duty things herself, and she was listening and nodding her head and agreeing with Bill. And Bill says, let me tell you my personal story, because maybe it'll have a message for you there. And he says, you know, last night I returned from Russia. Now, this is the former head of the CIA under President Nixon and President Ford, and he's sitting me down and telling me that I just better listen. He says, last night I returned from Russia. He said, what was I doing in Russia? He said, I was there, and remember, this is 3 weeks before the Gorbachev coup that changed Russia forever, right? The collapse of Russia. He said, I was there in Russia with kind of a secret group of people whose names you would instantly recognize, and those powerful people from all over the world, names like myself, you know, Colby, head of the CIA. He said, we were there to save Russia from a revolution when and if it collapses, so that it doesn't explode into World War, Third World War. He said, this is what we're doing, trying to actually work with the people we had been defeating to prevent a revolution. Okay, and he says, it was the night before I was due to come home. He said, last night. He said, I was in my hotel right there on Red Square, the most sacred place in all of Russiandom or communism. He said, and I couldn't sleep, and I got thinking about just how significant these world events were that were occurring. He says, so I decided, excuse me, what the heck? I'm just going to go for a walk. He said, I knew that was forbidden because, you know, you can't just go walking around Red Square in the middle of the night, particularly if you're the head of the CIA who spent 40 years trying to destroy Russia. He said, but I thought I'd see how far I could get. He says, I walk out past the guards, nobody's paying attention. He said, I go out of the hotel. There I am in Red Square, in front of the tomb of Lenin, walking up to the doors of the Kremlin itself. He said, nobody cared. Nobody was paying attention. Here was the head of the CIA, the most hated, the most feared enemy that communism had over the years, Bill Colby, head of the CIA during the most critical time. He said, and then it struck me. He said, then I realized it. He said, we'd won. The Cold War was over. Russia was dead. Communism was dead. He said, after 40 years, and Reverend, these are his words, not mine now. He said, after 40 years of fighting the bastards, we had won. We'd won. It was over. The Cold War was done, and I was the only one on the whole planet to recognize it and know it right then at that instant. And then he said, something else struck me. Something that just really slammed me. And I said, well, what was that? And he said, I realized that this walk I was having in Red Square was it. That was the only parade I was ever going to have for all our achievements. There wasn't going to be the ticker tapes down Madison Avenue. There wasn't going to be the waving. And he said, it was over, and we'd won, and this was my private parade, and it was the only one. I said, okay, Bill, now we've heard about your private parade and the defeat of communism, so on and so on. What's that got to do with Franklin and this whole mess I'm trying to get something? He said, sometimes you better face up to the fact, and this is one of those times that things you're involved in have significance, and people too big, too powerful, events and things involved that you don't even know about, that are just too big and powerful for you to deal with, and you have to face up the fact that maybe in the time frame you'd like to deal with them, in the way you'd like to deal with them, can't be done. He said, and sometimes evil does succeed for a while, and that's just, you have to walk away from it, get away from it, And he says the only way Franklin will ever get exposed and where it leads to and what it goes is if the national press, an independent national press, just like happened in Watergate, happened in Iran-Contra, happened with old Joe McCarthy, if the independent national press really gets interested and delves into it and takes it all the way to where it leads.
Is there such a thing anymore in this country?
See, that's why I said, well, how do you do that, Bill? He says, I'll help y'all. I know some, and he's called and notified a number of people. He says the problem is getting one of them to really put the investigative research and reporters onto it and not have them back off and where it leads. Well, so I went home, thought about it, was frustrated, and I thought, okay, I'll do my part to start it. I'll write the story of Franklin as a documentary, with the things that are available right now today that show there was clearly, at least again in my opinion, a cover-up. I won't mince words, I won't hedge things, I'll spit it out straight, and what it cost me, but at least the foundation will be there. And of course, since writing the book, I've learned a lot more. I now believe, I think I'm beginning to understand maybe a little more of what Bill was saying and where this thing really does lead. And I think now I'm finally understanding why it's so powerful, where it leads, as I say, and I think it leads into things that almost move into the fantasy world that we went to movies and watched in the 60s and 70s and 80s. In other words, the mysteries of the Cold War battle, and how far governments go with their secret services, whether it be the CIA or the Gestapo or the KGB in Russia. And I believe, and I know this sounds like I'm floating off into fantasy land, right?
Yeah, I'll tie a rope and bring you back here.
Yeah, right. And I'd have been the first one a few years ago to say, well, yeah, make a good movie, but you aren't going to believe any of this. Here's what I believe. I believe that Franklin had a lot of personalities who, through one way or another, were linked up to the Cold War effort, the CIA, and other things back during the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, we ran across some information about Larry King at one point that it looked like that he had, at one time, had some ties with the CIA.
He did, and I document some of those in the book. But beyond that, information I've learned since I wrote the book, I have no doubt now, no doubt Larry King was one of the underlings of the CIA, involved in a specific program, recruiting particularly young boys, particularly a particular kind of boy, who were then used in a kind of mental programming, brainwashing, if you would, that we were doing, to use them for such things as assassinations, such things as drug dealing. Remember, drug dealing back during the 70s and 80s, we now know pretty well was one of the main methods to finance our covert operations. We were actually involved in drug dealing, and even a lot of those things.
That sounds like
sex, blackmail, so on and so forth. And I believe, control thing. Yeah, mind control thing. Now, as I say, it sounds, if anybody's listening, I think, yeah, Decamp is off with the Lulu birds. You know, like Manchurian Candidate. You remember that old movie where they...
Yeah.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is I think that is an integral part of this. If you have that kind of thing at stake, particularly because of the personalities that it goes up to ultimately, the American public would be shocked to find that, yes, our government really did these things. Same thing we accuse the other guys of doing, which they were doing too.
Well, Congress investigated that back in the early 50s, and the CIA...
Yeah, but remember this, sophistication of the 50s was nothing compared to what it was in the 70s and 80s. This is post-Vietnam. We had suffered our worst defeat in the history of this country, our only defeat. We're not going to let it happen again. Between 75 roughly and 86 roughly was the most intense Cold War period in this country. I mean, it was just that close to a hot war at all times. We always think of the Cuban crisis as the time. Not really. 75 to 86. Remember the evil empire? Remember Star Wars? Remember the contest to see who could build up faster? That's what finally broke the Russians. They just couldn't keep up in the contest financially. So that was the period when technology was going rampant. Remember the invention of the computer, the understanding of the human mind so much more. And the information I've learned since the book came out that is poured in from a variety of sources makes me believe that that may well be why it's necessary for the protection of our entire government, in a sense, embarrassment, what people would believe, what people would feel about their government if they knew some of the things that we had done, programs
you feel that's
that we
the motive
engaged.
for the cover-up?
I think that's one of the major motives.
Besides
And
people just protecting themselves.
other people, of course, have a vested interest in protecting themselves. If you're a pedophile, a child abuser, these kind of things, you're certainly willing to cooperate. If you're a judge or an official who got your position as a result of help from this or that.
Or if
Remember
you've been
another
compromised.
factor, and this I'm now convinced of, which I didn't know when I wrote the book. Offutt Air Force Base. If you're going to pick the most sacred military installation in the United States for the last, what, 40 years, where is it? It's Offutt Air Force Base, right in the center of the United States.
Heartland, USA.
The furthest you can get from Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I am convinced now that there was a major CIA operation out of there, handled there, and of course, Omaha, the heartland, the least likely place in the world, to have something like this, that's a major part of this.
Who would think
and
it?
Larry King was merely a tool in this whole thing. You watched during the Larry King activities, remember? Whenever something would happen where he might, like he was going to go to Bush and get this thing straightened out, remember?
Right, at that breakfast.
They grab Larry, and whoop, he's off, declared crazy. And then we get things back under control, and Larry King comes back, and whoop, then we get him off again, and he's crazy.
Yeah.
Then finally, we get things contained, we get through grand juries, we never call Larry King in the grand juries or anything else, and then Larry King ends up in a very quick, quiet plea, having nothing to do with any of the things except he stole some money.
Yeah.
Okay, and then he gets sentenced, but when all things are considered, he'll be out in a relatively short time, and he's in one of probably what's considered the nicest federal institution. They call it the Holiday Inn of institutions, you know.
And bundles of money stashed away in foreign banks.
Well, I suspect...
Jamaica and Spain and Switzerland, etc.
So it's in the interest, if indeed I'm correct, and I don't do this in the book, I don't deal with the things I'm talking about now, quite frankly.
I'm going to have to cut you short at this point, John, because we're running out of time on this particular program. We're going to pursue this on our next program, so keep those thoughts in mind. We'll come back to them. But I want to take this opportunity to have our viewers write for this book, The Franklin Cover-Up, and I have read it cover to cover, and it's accurate. I know from our own research that there isn't anything in here that is absolutely not documented and verified from a lot of different sources. The book is also available in the local bookstore, and you can go in and buy it for $7.95. We will send it to you postpaid for $9. So if you'll just write to the address on your screen that's showing right now, send us $9. We'll be happy to send you this book, and you can read the facts for yourself and make your own decision concerning the cover-up. We really recommend this highly, and we would like to get it distributed as broadly as we possibly can so that the true story of what went on with this Franklin case finally comes out in the open. We're committed to seeing that happen. We know you are too, John. And so we're going to do whatever we can to keep at it until this thing breaks open. Do you, just for our viewers today, have any closing remarks for this program concerning what you believe would be helpful for them to do to assist in getting this information out?
You know, you've heard that phrase 100 times, truth is stranger than fiction. I finally understand it. It's a classic statement. It's classically true. Read the book. Try to tear it apart. Try to tear it apart. Say, well, this can't be, and then do some checking yourself. I think you're going to be surprised.
And then share the book with your friends.
And you know, before it's all said and done, I said something in the book, and I believe it more and more now. There should be another grand jury, this one that isn't rigged and controlled, that has an independent, honest prosecutor to investigate the whole original grand jury and everything surrounding it. That's what I believe. And maybe citizens can get a petition and do that. That may be ultimately the one thing they have the ability to do, and let's do it.
Well, we hope that we can, John, and thank you again for being with us. Folks, thank you for being with us today, and we'll be back with you on our next program. Hello, I'm John Morrow, and with me again today is our guest, John Decamp. John's the author of a new book entitled The Franklin Cover-Up: Child Abuse, Satanism, and Murder in Nebraska. We're putting the publisher's address up on the screen for you, AWT Publishing of Lincoln, Nebraska, and you are invited to send your inquiries to them. As a matter of fact, you can send your money to them, $7.95 plus postage, and they will be happy to mail you the book. Or you can write to us, and we'll be happy to do the same. John, when we closed our last interview, we were talking about some really wild and wonderful things, but I think that the title, The Franklin Cover-Up, really invokes a lot of ideas in people's minds of conspiracies and things like that. And this whole thing about cover-up and hoax and all that seemed to come from the grand jury. Now, in our book, entitled The Carefully Crafted Hoax, we really zeroed in on the grand jury findings and also the people that they were dealing with, Troy Bonner and Danny King and Alicia Owen, Paul Benassi. We didn't get into a lot of the background that you did because you really spread a lot further afield than we did, but I think for our viewers' information, it'd be good for us to explore just how a grand jury operates. A lot of people have the idea that it's like a courtroom situation. You know, you go in before the judge and you present the pros and the cons, and you've got the prosecutor and the defense, and then you've got the jury sitting there to decide, okay, we've heard both sides of the story, now we make up our mind as to what is the truth, and they find the defendant either innocent or guilty and so on. But my understanding is that's not at all how a grand jury operates, and so I think it'd be helpful for our viewers if you just give them some background information on the process.
Well, interestingly enough, a grand jury is exactly the opposite of what you've described. And a grand jury can be the most wonderful device or the worst device, depending literally upon who's in charge of it and how they handle it. Now, let me give you a little background on the grand jury, just so you understand. It can be wonderful because sometimes it can do what individual prosecutors won't do or are afraid to do, or it can do what a citizen might be afraid to do individually. That is, in complete safety and secrecy, it accuses somebody of something. So the purpose of a grand jury is strictly that, to either accuse or not accuse somebody or some entity of some crime. Okay? It isn't to try to see both sides of the question at all. That isn't the issue. The controller, the man in charge, woman in charge, whatever, of a grand jury is, of course, the prosecutor or a special prosecutor.
In the Franklin case, in the Douglas County grand jury,
they completely control what's presented to the jury. The second, maybe most important person, well, would be the grand jury foreman.
Mm-hmm.
The grand jury foreman, selected from among the members. So people have to get out of their head the idea that there was a trial in a grand jury or that both sides were presented or anything else. Quite the contrary. The purpose is to get information and make an accusation and see if that person in a court then later can defend themselves against this accusation.
So in effect, what the special prosecutor, in this case it was Samuel Van Pelt, but the special prosecutor then presents information that he chooses to present.
He can do literally anything he wants, pretty much.
To the grand jury, and his purpose is then to really accuse or seek an indictment.
Yeah.
And so that's his purpose then, is to really...
But I touched on a point. I said it can be the worst or the best thing. It can do some things that maybe wouldn't get done otherwise. But the scary thing about a grand jury, remember, everything is supposedly, well, is secret.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the idea. That gives you the safety of walking in there and saying, well, yeah, I know this, but man, I'm afraid to say anything, you know. Okay, so that's a protection. And supposedly everything in that grand jury is kept secret, maybe forever.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I have seen the documents, and I'm not allowed to tell you. I wish everything in that grand jury, and a lot more, could all be made public, just like in the Kennedy thing they're talking about. I think in this case, as I've tried to document very clearly in the book, the grand jury was used for the other purpose. When things started getting out of control in Franklin, as you recall, rumors everywhere, the Decamp memo came out, the lid was blowing off. Peter Citron's deal comes out, one thing after another coming out day by day. You had to get things under control again.
Legislature was putting heat on the
Legislature was putting. What do? You call a grand jury, and that could still be wonderful if they had, in my opinion, a proper grand jury. I don't think they did. Again, my opinion. So
Sure.
Okay.
Is there any possibility that those records would ever be opened or unsealed?
Maybe another grand jury could investigate it, and that might be one of the outcomes. I don't know. But let me tell you something. People forget. You know, when the public has about a 6-month memory, they say, to remember something called Watergate.
Mm-hmm.
If you'll go back and study Watergate, the heart of Watergate, the control mechanism used, was a grand jury.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, when it started, the lid boiling off, accusations flying, and it really started looking like it was out of control, just about exactly the same thing here, they called a federal grand jury.
Special prosecutor.
Special prosecutor. They cleared everybody. They said, no, there's nothing wrong. It really is just, you know, a third-rate burglary and so on. Later, as the final Watergate thing unfolded and the truth came out a couple of years later, somebody kept pursuing it. In this case, it was the press. And, okay. They went back and they asked the people in the grand jury, you know, wait a minute. You were honest people, and most grand jury members are.
Yes.
They said, well, yeah. Well, how come the grand jury never got into these things? And you know what they found out? Exactly what I'm telling you happens. And
they never heard about it.
We never heard about any of those things. The prosecutor never asked those questions of anybody. Well, that's why I say a grand jury can be the best or worst device. It can be a device, the key device used for cover-up in big things, or the device to expose it and finally correct it. I believe in this case, and I offer pretty good documentation, I believe, and I hope more will come out in the future, that this grand jury was for the purpose of covering up. And
not because the jurors decided that.
No. The jurors could be the most sincere, honest people in the world. I suspect most of them were. But let me use another example. If you go over to North Korea today, which is a totally, completely controlled society, they believe that their guy, whatever his name is just akin to a god. The only information they got via the newspaper, via the press, via everything, you know, is what is fed to them.
Right.
You can brainwash the entire country. Well, certainly in a very small, confined grand jury of 18 people, if you present them only one side of a picture, you can make black, white, up, down, right, left, good, bad, etc. I feel comfortable in saying that's what occurred. That's what occurred in Watergate. That's what occurred here.
One of the things that we're recently reminded of with respect to juries and their findings is that juries do not always find according to the facts of the case, even though they can be presented the facts of the case. They can find
Reverend,
out.
I'm going to pick one little piece to show you, and I can legally do this one because it's a matter of public record now. I can't tell you 1,000 other things I'd love to because I'm legally forbidden. And that's why I say I think our grand jury rules in Nebraska maybe need some changing too. We have probably the worst in the country.
Maybe that's a goal that we can shoot for.
That's definitely one. But anyway, the grand jury did something that grand juries normally don't do, and I don't think are legally supposed to do. That is, they wrote this lengthy report where they supposedly named names and cleared everybody and said this is a good guy, and then they went off and without indicting or accusing these people of any crime, just called other people names from victim witnesses to individuals out in the community to people like me who were saying institutions of government are corrupt. Anybody they could, they called a name who was saying there's something wrong.
That sounds like a smear.
Okay. But one other thing they did, and as I say, I can cite this example. I can cite this example because it's a matter of public record. I want to make that clear because I am forbidden from revealing 80 jillion other things that I would love to. In the grand jury report, the grand jury said about the witness Paul Bonacci, they said, and even his psychiatrist says he is incapable of telling the truth. Right?
I remember
you remember reading that?
Yes.
It was headlined in the World Herald in a picture.
Yes.
And Bonacci indicted was his name, Paul Bonacci.
Right.
They said, if you read the grand jury report, and you read the 1,000 times it must have been printed in the World Herald on the front page and otherwise saying this, they said, you'd immediately conclude, first of all, his psychiatrist, his own psychiatrist, testified before the grand jury and said, well, you know, it's too bad, but this kid's incapable of telling the truth. That's exactly, they wrote it.
That's
in the grand jury report.
Right.
You read it, right?
Yes.
Now here's the truth. Here's the truth. One, he had no psychiatrist.
Yes, we know that.
Two, the psychiatrist that they're referring to and talking about was a police psychiatrist. The
Right.
police investigating the kid.
Right.
Three, most shocking of all, the psychiatrist never ever testified before the grand jury.
Right.
And four, and here it is, the very psychiatrist that they claim testified before the grand jury, the very psychiatrist they said was his who wasn't, the very same psychiatrist who they said this kid is incapable of telling the truth, in fact, under oath, repeatedly before the legislative committee, publicly now and otherwise, says the precise opposite, that he's telling the truth and he's probably incapable of telling a lie.
Yeah.
He was the one that diagnosed the boy
Right.
as having multiple personality and said one of the characteristics of this is that you don't have to lie. Typical MPDs, multiple personality disorder, which I didn't even believe existed, didn't understand, and now it's amazing, as you well know. But anyway, he said one of the characteristics is that
They don't
have to lie. They simply move to another personality.
Switch
Another person comes
personality.
out and they tell the truth. Okay, so I use this one classic example out of the grand jury because it so illustrates how black can be made to white, how up, down, left, right. Now what happened to the kid? They indicted him for lying. I agreed, after being contacted by some people, to go see the kid and act as his lawyer at his request. I did, and after I started looking at the facts, I made a statement. I made it repeatedly, and I made it boldly and maybe foolishly even, but angrily. And I said, I dare him. I dare him to take this kid to trial. They had him charged with felony after felony after felony because he said he was abused by prominent people, including the publisher of the World Herald, that he was here on this date with these people, that he saw Alicia Owen. They indicted him for all these things they said are lies. I said, I dare him. I beg him. Take him to court.
There's really nothing that's been handled in open court in this whole deal.
No, nothing in open court on anything. Anyway, so what'd they do? When we were ready, they simply dismissed all the charges.
Just dropped the whole thing.
Not only that, but two other psychiatrists, experts, were brought in, not by the kid, because hell, he couldn't afford it, but by the legislative committee hired an expert from New York to come in.
Yes, I remember that.
Court in Omaha ordered another psychiatrist, a specialist, to come in. They both examined the kid at length, investigation after investigation. You know what they concluded? What they said?
Yes, I know.
They said exactly the same thing. The other way, they said, hey, multiple personality, and this kid is telling the truth. He's a victim of horrible abuse. He's not lying, on and on and on. The very, very same thing. Three of them in a row. So, as I say, that's why I say I dared him. I begged him to bring him to trial. So a grand jury, to get back to where we were, a grand jury can be a wonderful thing, or it can be a device for abuse and cover-up.
But essentially, the grand jury just simply takes the information that's presented by the prosecutor. He's in control of the process, and it can turn out about any way he decides it to turn out, just simply by his choice of what to present and what not to present.
Well, let me give another example, because I live this one about 27 times every day as soon as I get home. I come walking into the house. My little 3-year-old comes running up to me and grabs my leg and hugs me, and I pat him on the head, and he says, Anna hit me. Well, Anna, real name Shanda, is my 9-year-old. And I said, well, did you do something to her? Oh, no, no, no. Anna hit me, no reason, you know. So you check a little further, and you talk to Anna, and you find out, well, but Johnny took her pencil and broke it and smeared paint all over her wall in her room. And she caught him in the act and hit him on the behind. And I then turned to Johnny and said, well, wait a minute, Johnny, were you in her room making all this mess? And, well, yeah, but she hit me, and that's... Now, if I had only listened to little Johnny when I go home, why, every night I'd walk in and I'd say, Anna, Shanda, I'm tired of you beating little Johnny. You got to stop that. You're bad. Well, then I get into the living room by about this time, and Tara, my 7-year-old, comes running up to me, and she says, Jenny, who's my 16-year-old now, she won't let me practice piano in the basement. Well, I want Tara to practice her piano because it's important if she's going to learn to plunk and make a racket like all the other kids, that she be able to do it. I said, well, did you do anything? Oh, no, I didn't do anything wrong. She just won't let me play down here. She won't let me practice. Well, so then maybe when you check a little further, you find out that it wasn't quite that way. Maybe she was down there practicing and making a racket that Jenny couldn't do her homework, and she really wasn't practicing so much as she was watching television and a whole bunch of other things, and Jenny finally got tired and ran her out of the basement. So, as I say, when you get the whole story, you might come up with a completely different conclusion. Truth is somewhere in the middle, or in a lot of cases, even the opposite. The one visible example, and there's gobs of them, that I can give you of a grand jury legally, on the most visible thing of all was their key indictment charging perjury of this kid, and them actually lying in their report.
So
now, they didn't lie deliberately, I don't think, the grand jury did. They were deceived, right?
They were deceived.
They were deceived, or they couldn't have written that. They couldn't have dared to write something like this for a report that they know is going to be examined. They didn't have 18 people of a grand jury sit and lie about that, even though it's completely false. That means they were deceived. Who deceived them? Who's in charge of a grand jury? The prosecutors.
Right.
In this case, when the person to run the grand jury was picked, literally everybody who was anybody who knew about the judicial process, who knew about grand juries, what was at stake, condemned the selection.
Yes, I remember that.
You remember that? They said, you know, something bad can happen and probably will happen as a result of this. This is not right. This person shouldn't be picked.
Sure enough.
Now, sure enough, he got picked, and sure enough. So, a grand jury can be the best or worst thing, and in this case, it was the worst thing.
And I saw an article.
It's a heart of the cover-up.
Yeah, I saw an article in the paper just this last week, and it was just a little short thing, couple of inches, and it had to do with a Supreme Court finding in a case that involved a grand jury and its indictment, and they specifically said the grand jury is not required to listen to both sides of an issue.
Oh, that was U.S. Supreme Court. They reaffirmed the fact that, hey, they're not there to listen to sides.
The grand
they're not
jury,
there to get facts.
They just
on the whole,
right,
they're there to indict.
In accusatory information and anything that...
And they specifically said, like I told you, they ratified the fact, they approved, once again, that the prosecutor doesn't have to tell him. He can deliberately, for whatever reasons, hide all the rest of the story,
even
so to speak.
evidence that might confirm that the individual would be innocent, could be hidden by the special prosecutor.
A grand jury, if I were going to use a good example, is like a knife. I can take that knife and I can ram it in your heart, and it's not going to be used very wisely. At least most people would agree with that. Or I can take that knife and I can use it to cut bread. I can use it to help fix my meals at home. This kind of thing. It's a tool, it's a device that can be used or abused, and...
Exactly the point we want to make. It is a tool in the hands of the special prosecutor and can be used for whatever purpose he designs.
And if you have a corrupt prosecutor...
You're going to get mixed results.
No, you're going to get bad results. And if you have a system, as in the Franklin case, with so much at stake, going so high up, involving such serious matters for very powerful, rich, and prominent people, then they have the ability, apparently, at least in Nebraska, to control who that prosecutor is and make sure they put in somebody that will do what they want. And I believe that's what occurred.
So this cover-up really went at several levels. One of the things that you mention in your book is that one phase of the cover-up involved the police, and then we've just talked about another phase which involved the Douglas County Grand Jury. Another phase involved the FBI. Would you want to make a comment on either the phase that involved the police, which would include not only the Omaha
Remember, the police or the State Patrol or any of these agencies are going to back off in a hurry when the FBI steps in and says, hey, this is the way it is, we're handling this, you bug out. In this particular case, as I think I pretty well document, the FBI had ample reason, and reasons probably we'll never even know, for not wanting certain things to come out. Everything, the way it was handled in this case, one after another. You never have You never have things handled in such a way that the public ever really gets access to information. It's always controlled information. And in this case, I believe the FBI, maybe even arguing for reasons of national security. That seemed to be the big argument they always used for a lot of things. Well, national security is at stake. If indeed, drug money running and laundering of money for use in covert operations by
the intelligence
CIA, the intelligence community, was involved here, and I guess I no longer have even a shadow of a doubt that's what's at stake. And it involves prominent people who we know, and you know. It's easy and quick for the FBI or high officials to say this involves national security. You don't need to know. You don't want to know what's at stake. Just take our word for it. Judges are going to listen. Police are going to listen. Prosecutors are going to listen.
Well, we saw this process at work here, and let me just put this in. When the Attorney General's office was supposed to be investigating the allegations of sexual abuse that surfaced early on in the Franklin thing, and they had assigned, the Attorney General's office assigned one of their special investigators to look into it, and then he'd met with the Omaha Police Department, and then 6 months later nothing had still been done about it, and it became apparent that what he had done was he had simply backed off because he was convinced that the Omaha Police Department was handling the investigation, and he didn't want to cross their tracks and mess up their case, etc., etc. So that same thing supposedly then could have been at work with the police department if the FBI comes in and says, we're looking at this, and so you back off, and so the police department backs off, and the FBI says, this is our deal. We have several instances where witnesses and potential witnesses were actually intimidated in their questioning by the FBI.
Oh, yes, and I think I document at least 3 or 4 of the ones I legally can about as clear as anything's ever been documented. And that if after you read that and read those documents, and those aren't my words. I didn't create these documents.
No, you're just reporting them.
I'm just reporting them. This is a documentary book. But, you know, I know when you start talking about, oh, God, you mean Franklin involves drug running and pedophilia and blah, 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 even national security things they might be trying to cover up. People think, yeah, sure, right, and the moon is made of cheese and on and on. And that was my attitude. Believe me, it was. Now, I have no doubts. And the hardest thing for me is to know something and, you know, not be able to impart it and say, yeah, in this case, the moon is made of cheese, and here's... So I try in the book to offer as much documentation as possible. Now, the point I was trying to get to here is a few pieces that we do know, that years ago people like me used to deny.
A lot of denial.
Let me give you one. What was the thing we heard so often in the newspapers? Accusations from, let's say, a Fidel Castro or some communist country. One of the most often made accusations was, well, this news reporter here is really a CIA operative. Yeah, right? And you say, oh, shit. I mean, shoot. They accuse everybody of being CIA. You know, everybody and his brothers are always accused of being CIA. We now know. We now know. In fact, my friend Bill Colby, the former head of the CIA, who, as I say, I stay with when I go to Washington, I think he's going to do a program here for one of the local radio stations. He's confirmed to me repeatedly, now that we've grown old, that the CIA indeed had as their fundamental pool news people, particularly prominent people in the press, prominent people in the world press, people that could travel internationally and have the credentials and freedom that can only come from one place. Only one place, the press. The press is the only one in every country in the world that has access to just everything, and you can't interfere with them.
When you start
the press is the only one. Now, let me take it further. In Nebraska, who was one of the key people in the whole Franklin thing, whether he likes to admit it or not? Harold Anderson, the publisher
of the Omaha
World, one of the major stockholders. How did Harold Anderson start out? He started out in that key time when the CIA was recruiting like maniacs, young, intelligent, capable, investigative reporters.
And he's been involved in the world press scene.
No, more than that. More than that. Harold Anderson is the only person in the history of the United States, in the history of the world, to have been president, I believe, of both the World Press Association and the National Press Association. I forget the exact names. Only one in the history. I mean, this man is Mr. Big on the international and national scene. Those are the kinds of people who were top CIA operatives during the critical years of the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s during the most intense Cold War period of all. That was our Army. That was our war machine. And so, remote and wild as it sounds, you start adding a piece here, a piece there, additional information that's poured out since Franklin from the location of Offutt as the safest, most important base we have in the world, the CIA factor, the fact we're now learning that drugs were used as one of the devices for financing our covert operations.
Yes. No question about it.
The fact that if anybody at all was going to be used, or a top person in the CIA, it would be press people who maintained their cover and were doing the best thing for this country. They were our Army. They were our soldiers. People like Harold Anderson. So, am I saying Harold Anderson is a top CIA operative?
It opens some interesting possibilities.
I think he knows, and I think he knows I know.
Yeah.
Whether he is or is not.
It opens a whole.
I won't say the next words, but yeah. I'll say he knows and I know.
Well, that's a whole new area and a whole new realm to explore. But,
yeah, and as I say, it sounds like Fantasyland, doesn't it? Well,
explain some things concerning motivation for cover-up, and it certainly goes far beyond the local scene and just some local pedophiles protecting themselves from exposure. But
much more than that.
Unfortunately, I've always wondered why the FBI would be so interested in something that supposedly did not cross state boundaries. You say that, well, there's no evidence of child abuse. The FBI says there's no evidence of these kids being transported for prostitution purposes. The FBI says that there's nothing to these allegations, and yet they were very keenly interested in dealing with witnesses, trying to find out who they were, intimidating them in their interrogation process, and doing everything they could to seemingly muddy the waters as far as any legitimate investigation by the Franklin Committee was concerned.
Well, as I pointed out, I think I really offer some pretty good documentation in the book on the FBI, what they've done. You make your own judgments as to whether that constitutes cover-up. I say it does. That's my belief. Not made-up things, but documentation. Even involving such things as, who was this guy that sued the FBI in Omaha? Roshan. What'd they end up paying him quietly, finally?
No,
$1 million. I think it was $1 million plus about $500,000 in legal fees.
Right.
And basically, he was making the same allegations. He was an insider. He was one of the FBI in Omaha.
Right.
And people don't know about this. The World Herald doesn't print big stories about this.
Right. The whole office seemed like it was a pool of perverts.
But they paid him $1 million. Keep $1 million to go away, shut up, and be happy.
Right. Yeah, well, folks, you can find out about this by ordering the book, The Franklin Cover-Up, by John Decamp. It does do just exactly what it says. It tells the story of child abuse, Satanism, and murder in Nebraska, and it doesn't go into a lot of detail about the murder because there have been probably up to date about 15 very unusual and unexplained deaths of people related to this case. But you can order this book by sending us $9. The book is $7.95 at your bookstore. We'll send it to you postpaid for $9. So write to us at the address that's shown on your screen, and we'll be happy to get it to you in the return mail. You need to read it for yourself, make your own conclusions, share it with a friend, and then we need to start generating some groundswell of grassroots indignation in this state to get some things changed, so that this kind of thing doesn't go on, or that it doesn't happen again. So by all means, get the book. And John, we surely do appreciate your spending the time with us. We'd hope to have you back again in the future at some point, and as other information is developed and other facts come out and they're documented and become available for public consumption, why, we'd sure want to know about that and keep our folks updated on what's going on. Appreciate your spending the time with us.
Thank you, Reverend.